The Art of Living by Sharon Labelle, as I stated before, is an interpretation of the Art of Living written by Epictetus. The book is a manual on virtue, happiness, and effectiveness, and it consists of 93 insightful and sometimes a bit humorous instructions on how to live life and its challenges, and persevere and become the best version of yourself. The reason I chose this interpretation is that I felt it is the perfect introduction to philosophy, specifically Stoicism. And it's a bit more modern. I'm referring to the language, of course. I feel it is appropriate now to examine our first excerpt from The Art of Living by Sharon Labelle. And it goes like this. Moral progress is not the natural province of the highborn, nor is it achieved by accident or luck, but by working on yourself daily. This is how Sharon beautifully expresses Epictetus' spirit and beliefs. Epictetus would want us to ask ourselves two questions. How do I live a happy, fulfilling life? And how could I be a good person? Which I pulled directly from the book as well. Let me state now, my goal in using this book and any works of art in the future is to share my interpretation of ideas expressed in these works of art. Why I say this, I want to clarify. My interpretation is by no means a fair substitute for any body of work, because frankly, I'm a young-minded man, and mainly because I'm me and they are themselves. With that being said, I encourage all listeners to this podcast to buy all works of art mentioned on this podcast, because again, this podcast is no substitute. I would also love for listeners to read along with me while I'm quoting pieces. Now let's move on to Epictetus. Who was he? Epictetus was born into slavery in Greece, inside the Roman Empire, and was owned by Epaphroditus, Nero's administrative secretary. The origin of Epictetus' education is for the most part unknown, except that he was sent by his master to study under a Stoic teacher by the name of Musonius Rufus for quite some time, a man who had plenty of works advocating for women to be treated as equal, which is fascinating given the period. Epictetus was a star student and was later gifted with his freedom as a result. Philosophers were later banned because of their growing influence in the year 94, and soon after, Epictetus began teaching again in Nicopolis. He had Marcus Aurelius as a student, probably one of the most well-known Stoic philosophers there is, and the Emperor of Rome as well. Later in his life, Epictetus developed a limp from being beaten as a slave, and presumably developed arthritis as a result. He continued his teachings until he died around 135, the year, not the age. Epictetus' best-known works are the Discourses, which is composed of his lectures, the Enchiridion, which is filled with his Stoic morals. Both were transcribed by his pupil, Arrian. And lastly, The Art of Living, of course. There's something special about Epictetus, something you admire, something you hope to mimic, at least for me. And I feel like he would be humble in hearing that statement. By definition, Epictetus was a slave, but only by definition. Epictetus believed that if one is a slave, they too, like everyone else, can live free. He believed that nothing, not even slavery, could prevent you from developing a virtuous character. This is why I love Epictetus. As amazing as it was for the Emperor of Rome, Marcus Aurelius, to be a Stoic and have so much self-reflection and concern about developing a virtuous character, I believe it is equally as impressive for Epictetus to be Stoic as, at times, a beaten but never broken slave. Now, I am not taken away from Marcus at all. I love meditations, but isn't it a little mind-boggling? The Emperor of Rome, of one of the most powerful and largest empires in history, was at some point taught philosophy by a physically impaired man who was once a slave. That's obviously a summary, lacking important detail, but it's true even in its simplicity. If I told you that sentence without the context, you wouldn't believe me. It sounds like a movie. That's neither here nor there. Epictetus believed that we should be concerned with the person we are becoming and what kind of life we are living. Now, what is Stoicism? Personally, I'm a fan of definitions, so let's start there. According to the Oxford Dictionary, Stoicism is the ancient school of philosophy at Athens, founded by Zeno of Citium. Now, that is technically Stoicism, but it is so much more. The best way I can think of to explain Stoicism is a quote from the show The Sopranos, weirdly enough. And if you're asking yourself, is he talking about that show with mobsters and mental illness? Yes, that's the show. Don't worry, I'm not going to spoil anything, so I'll use as little information as possible, but the context is very important. A character was in the hospital in pretty bad shape, and someone left them a note that said, Sometimes I go about in pity for myself, and all the while a great wind carries me across the sky. Obuiji saying. Now, before anyone searches it or corrects me, I know Obuiji was not a philosopher. Obuiji was a Native American tribe located in what is currently southern Canada. But when I was 16 and watched that scene, I immediately searched for the quote on Google and watched the video on YouTube, like the information sponge millennial that I am. This man drew parallels between that quote and Stoicism, which was how I was introduced to this philosophy. To me, Stoicism is that quote, as the seed and all the knowledge that sprang from it is what grew. Sometimes I go about in pity for myself, and all the while a great wind carries me across the sky. We are all leaves blowing in the wind. The wind is the external events you can't control, no matter how hard you try. We may not like it, but why pity ourselves? The wind will be there either way, so we should focus on internal events, the ones we can control, before the wind stops blowing altogether, and we die. I know that may seem morbid, but in the eyes of the Stoics, I promise it's not. But I can't explain right now, because the wind is blowing me in another direction. So we'll just have to shelf this discussion until next week, because ironically, the second episode is titled, What You Can and Can't Control. With the end of this podcast nearing, I'd like to conclude it by saying, if you are listening to this podcast right now, that means you are alive, which means it's not over. Stay positive.